This is Chattanooga Civics. I'm Nathan Bird. Cities of all sizes use tax incentives to draw business and promote growth. Helen Burns Sharp founded Accountability for Taxpayer Money to better track and analyze the use of tax incentives in Chattanooga to ensure that these packages are balanced and effective. In this episode, we discuss the most common types of tax incentives and how they are used in Chattanooga. This episode is sponsored by Wiseman Music. Does your neighbor's dog howl when your piano is played? When your piano was last tuned, could you still ride the Chattanooga choo-choo? Then give Wiseman Music a call at 850-450-7867 to get that piano tuned and ready to play. That's 850-450-7867. Keep calm and play on in tune with Wiseman Music. I'd also like to thank my Patreon supporters, especially the Marks family and Stephen Culp.
My name is Helen Burns Sharp, and I'm with the organization called Accountability for Taxpayer Money, or ATM. I grew up in Chattanooga, and undergraduate school I went to Southern Methodist University and UT Knoxville. And then after that, I went to graduate school at the University of Texas at Austin, Hook'em Horns. And in my professional career, I worked for state government, county government, and city government in Southeast Tennessee and in Cobb County in the Atlanta metro area in Georgia, and then for the city of Albany, Oregon, which is where I spent the last 18 years of my career. Basically, in each of those stints over the course of my career, I was involved in land use planning, urban planning, and zoning and all. But particularly in Oregon, I was also involved pretty much in economic development and downtown redevelopment. And I guess I will have to say, or I want to say, that Oregon is sort of a masterclass for me in not only land use planning, but citizen participation and open government. So it has really informed a lot of what I have tried to do in Chattanooga. I'm trying to, because I did learn some different ways of doing things and so I'm trying, and sometimes I tell you a quote by former Mayor Ron Littlefield, whom I've known forever because we both worked for the Tennessee State Planning Office back in the early 70s. And Ron was telling somebody who's introducing me to somebody, he said, "You might have heard about Helen, but she's really not that bad. She's basically a good person, but then she went to Oregon." And that has somehow changed her, but he smiled when he said it. So anyway, and then after I retired in Oregon, I moved back to Chattanooga. And actually, while Chattanooga was home and I liked Chattanooga, probably if Chattanooga had been the Chattanooga that I left so many years ago, I might not have moved back here, particularly given that I loved Oregon so much. But wow, has Chattanooga changed? And so I came back, and I'm very glad that I did. I hope I'm able to contribute just a little bit. I live downtown. I'm a widow. My late husband was a Georgia Tech Renaissance man who was chairman of the Marion County, Tennessee Planning Commission. I met him in Big Jasper, Tennessee, where I spent several years in Marion County. And I think in some ways that was one of the most challenging and fulfilling parts of my entire career. Cobb County looks real good on the resume, fastest growing county in the country at the time or whatever. But when you're a generalist in an area that doesn't have any professional staff and you're trying to kind of do it all, it is really a challenge, and it does give you satisfaction to think that you've made things a little better in places such as that.
Yeah, and you mentioned kind of the growth in Chattanooga that we've seen over the past several decades, and something that comes up, and it's coming up more and more frequently these days, is you open the Chattanooga Times Free Press or the Chattanoogan or whatever news organization you follow here in town, and you'll see that such and such corporation has received some kind of tax break for their development, whether it's a building renovation or a new building. And it usually has some price tag associated with it of however many $1 million. And so I really want to talk to you. You're kind of the local expert at this, and in the form these tax breaks take, kind of the nuts and bolts of these different development agreements and how they affect the taxpayers and how they affect the companies that are receiving them. And so correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but it seems to me that most of these agreements either fall under pilots or TIFs. So I was hoping we'll start with pilots, just explain what is a pilot, how does it work, and what is the mechanism by which these companies are receiving that tax break.
Sure. Let me first, if I could, tell you a little bit about my organization, ATM,
Sure.
Accountability for Taxpayer Money. I need to introduce ATM here. When I came back to Chattanooga, I thought I would try to become a normal person. A lot of my friends that know me said that was probably not likely that was ever going to happen, but that was my goal, and I was going to do things that people did when they retired. I didn't know what those were. I thought it was you took lots of naps and you clipped coupons or something like that, but I was going to figure it out. But I had no agenda to become an activist or a watchdog or anything else, and it just happened to see in the newspaper that Chattanooga in 2012 had just approved its first tax increment financing project. And so I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. I think I'll follow this because I had worked on TIFs, and TIF can be a very good economic development tool. I was not anti-TIF at all. And I thought, well, I'll just kind of follow this in Chattanooga. And then when I followed it, I think in part based on my Oregon experience, I just had some questions. And this was Chattanooga's first TIF. So, I mean, everything's kind of a learning experience, but it just seemed like that there was more due diligence that needed to be done, maybe on that first project. And so I just decided to kind of get involved in that and sort of monitoring that. And there were a fair number of friends and people that I met who also felt like that this was an important topic and that they wanted to be involved. And so ATM is kind of a loosely knit group or whatever, but, we would exchange emails, and a lot of times, other people in addition to me would go to public meetings and sometimes speak at public meetings or whatever. And let me tell you first, talking about both TIFs and pilots collectively, that why I think that they're important. I mean, it's important that we do them right. And one has to do with what I'm going to call social justice. And that is the money that we don't collect due to tax incentives is money that could go towards affordable housing and infrastructure and police and fire and, basic city services or whatever, workforce development or whatever. And so like last year alone, due to TIFs and pilots, the city and the county, this is a combined number for the city and the county, but we did not collect $25 million because of these two incentives. Now, I will say a lot of that is Volkswagen. I mean, that's clearly the biggest one, but there are a number of others, and these add up. So anyway, that's kind of to the average person, that's kind of, a big chunk of change. And you can think about areas in city government and county government where that probably could be put to good use. So there's that aspect of it. And then the other reason I think this is an important issue is some people see sort of a kind of a tax equity or a fairness aspect to it. And they basically raise the question about, why is government picking winners and losers? Why are they sort of subsidizing some businesses and not others or whatever? So that's kind of the two things that kind of got me interested in this topic. And one of the most satisfying things about it is because of these two reasons that I just gave, this issue seems to resonate across the political spectrum. I can remember one time, 6 or 7 years ago, in 1 week, I was asked to speak at the meeting of the Chattanooga Tea Party, which is a little bit right of center. And that same week, I spoke to the Unity Group, a kind of a civil rights, social justice group that might be perceived as a little bit left of center. And they both said, yeah, we need to get a better handle on these tax incentives or whatever. So anyway, so that's sort of the reason that ATM, sort of got into this. And I think I can, not speaking for everyone at ATM, but that I think we all know how important jobs are, and jobs are important not only to the economy, but to the quality of life in the town. So this is in no way, an anti-business, anti-growth kind of organization at all. But I think, ideally, we believe that what we would like to see is good companies locating or expanding in Chattanooga, paying really good wages, making a sizable investment, and paying their fair share of property taxes. So we think if they're not going to pay their fair share and they're going to get some sort of subsidy, that there need to be good reasons for that. And now, I think you've started to ask about what's a pilot and what's a TIF. Do you want to go into that now?
Yeah, so I just want to point out something that you mentioned, that very broadly for both of these pilots and TIFs, this is tax money that is not being collected, correct? This is not a check that is written from the government to a corporation. It is a tax that would have otherwise been due that is not collected. Is that correct?
Well, it's even a little more complicated than this. Both, TIF stands for tax increment financing, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. And pilot is payment in lieu of taxes. They're both tax incentives, but a pilot is a tax abatement, meaning that if you're a company, and let's pick on Volkswagen, because I won't say something good about them later, but we'll pick on them for a minute since that's our biggest pilot. So what that means is that because of this pilot agreement, other than for schools, and I say other than, that's a hugely important thing that we do right in Chattanooga. We do collect all school property taxes, whether a company gets a TIF or a pilot. So that's good. So we're talking about the non-school portion. But when we give a pilot, that means that we don't collect some, or in the case of Volkswagen, all of their general fund property taxes that would normally be due. So the Volkswagen thing is a little bit atypical in that A, it's so big, and B, they got, I was quoted one time as saying that I thought we needed to give a pilot to Volkswagen, and I do, maybe we'll get to that in a little later, but that I think we gave them the sun, the moon, and the stars, when maybe the sun and the moon might have worked, because we basically let it last for 30 years. And unlike more recent things where we have a declining schedule, where maybe you don't pay any of your your general fund property taxes in the first year or two or whatever, in the case of Volkswagen, they don't pay any for 30 years. So, that's a huge incentive or whatever. But anyway, so the point is, that's an abatement. They just don't pay their property taxes other than for schools. Okay. And so that's like a gift. I mean, it isn't that we write them a check for that amount of money, but the money that we would collect ordinarily, we don't collect. A TIF is different in that the people, the property owners in a TIF district, they all pay property taxes just like you and I and other businesses pay property taxes to the city and the county. What's different there is any new property taxes in the TIF district that create what's called an increment. It's called tax increment financing. The new portion gets set aside, kind of diverted, and rather than going to the general fund departments of the city and county or whatever, it goes back into that particular project area to do typically infrastructure improvements. So it is not an abatement, but it is an incentive, and it does result in money not going to the general funds for what they normally, would be used for.
Got
And
it.
I probably confused you and everybody else with this. One of
Yeah.
these years, I'm going to learn how to say this in plain English, but these things are complicated.
So I'll try and sum it up and you can tell me if I've got this right. So pilots, payment in lieu of taxes. A company comes in and the government says you do not have to pay some certain percentage of these property taxes for X number of years.
That's correct.
Whatever the agreement, it changes,
Yes.
I'm sure, from agreement to agreement. So then a TIF, tax increment financing, you come in and you say, this is a $1 million piece of property and we're paying $10,000 in property taxes. And we're going to do enough work on this property that it's going to be worth $2 million next year. And that extra new $10,000, you've got the old $10,000 of taxes that you're paying. Now you would be paying $20,000, but that difference is set aside to be pumped back into that project and improving that infrastructure. Do I have that right?
That's a great summary of it. I think you got it.
Awesome. So I guess let's start with a broad question of why give any of these tax abatements or increment financing? Why use pilots and TIFs in general, or any other kind of tax program, tax incentive?
That's a very good question. And I think we should be, and by the way, let me say, and I hope I say several times, that we're getting better at this. Mm-hmm. That some of the things that I could talk about that got me started in this, we're not doing that anymore. But to me, I think probably I'm not a huge fan of pilots. At the same time, I agree that pilots need to be in our toolbox. And I think when we particularly want to be able to use a pilot is if a project is a game changer. And most of the companies we've given pilots to are not necessarily game changers. I mean, those are, few and far between. So clearly Volkswagen was a game changer. Okay. Secondly, we need to be convinced that they meet what's called the but-for test, meaning but for the incentive, they wouldn't locate here or expand here. And that's a hard thing to prove, but we need to drill down and really see if we believe that test is met. In the case of Volkswagen, we know that lots of places wanted Volkswagen. Almost every city and county these days has incentives in their toolbox. Huntsville, Alabama had a lot of the same attributes that we did, and they very much wanted Volkswagen. So that was a case where, it wasn't, I don't think, worth the risk of, do we want to take a hard line and say, oh, you're coming to Chattanooga because we're Gig City and we're the best place there is, which of course we are, because we couldn't risk losing them. And so in that sense, I mean, that's an unusual situation where something is that important and that, we feel that there is definitely competition and that we could lose them. I think what has happened in the past is a lot of companies hire site development consultants, and they come in and they meet with the chamber and they meet with the city people, and they basically say, well, my company wants to locate here, but we've got to have a tax incentive, or we're going to go to Tupelo or Mexico or Greenville or wherever. And that's just sort of the way the game is played. And if we don't, kind of drill down and we can't necessarily take that at face value, because I think it is the case that a lot of times when they come to see us, they've already made their decision. The tax break is really, the cake is baked, and the tax break is the icing on the cake. There's a national nonprofit known as Good Jobs First. Check out goodjobsfirst.org. And what they say, and they've looked at IRS records and all like that, and they make the point that most of a business's expense is on, salaries and benefits and marketing and transportation, et cetera, that city property taxes are maybe 2%. If that, I mean, this is not a huge amount of money for the company. Whereas you think about us, in the local government level, and we rely on property taxes for about 60% of our budgets. So, so that, I think that's one of the reasons that, we do need to be really careful. Like I say, on pilots, I'm into game changers, and I'm into definitely the but-for test. And another thing that we have sort of been playing with our hands tied behind our back for years, and including still, but we're doing better, is that we're one of the few places, certainly in Tennessee or maybe in the country, that gives pilots, and we don't have any written policies. So that is something I think is about to change. But we have needed written policies to sort of guide us. The chamber we outsource our pilot program to the Chamber of Commerce, and I don't fault the chamber for this, because the chamber kind of works for us. And if the city and the county aren't going to tell them what the policies are that they want them to apply. And I think the chamber, certainly, they do look at things, and they do look at but-for, number of jobs, amount of investment, and all like that. But I think, we need sort of a dose of professionalism in our pilot program. And I think we're getting there. And so you're right. I mean, I think part of why we need to give pilots is, I think we need to be strategic, and I would like to see that, fewer pilots. But I think because of the, here again, going back to Volkswagen, if there's something we really, really want that's a game changer, we need to have that tool if we think there's a good chance we might lose them. TIFs, I think, are a little different. I'm more kindly predisposed towards TIFs. But on the other hand, I think, TIFs too, TIFs typically, the classic TIF is in a blighted area. A classic TIF is a catalyst for something happening in an area that really needs kind of a shot in the arm for it to realize its potential. So, I'm not a big fan of TIFs for greenfields and gentrifying sites and things like that. But there are some instances. In fact, there's a TIF application on the table right now for a company that wants to build some Class A spec industrial space out near the old DuPont plant. And apparently Chattanooga is way behind our competition in terms of having this kind of a resource available or whatever. So here you've got an area that clearly could use a shot in the arm if you've driven by the old DuPont place lately on North Access Road. And this looks like this is something that could sort of change the dynamic in that neighborhood. So like with pilots, I think it's a tool we need to have. The problem with TIFs is, I think, could become that we need to be careful, because right now we have 3 TIFs already on the books, and then there's this one that may happen on North Access Road or whatever. And then there's some talk about the Foundry site, where there might be a baseball stadium, and I'll probably talk about that a little bit later. And then, there's the Bend site. I don't know that they're going to ask for a TIF, but I wouldn't be surprised. And I kind of hope they don't, because I think that's an example of a greenfield site that I'm not sure it meets the but-for test. But anyway, so, if we don't watch it, then, we can, the TIFs, our TIFs, in our policies, it says the maximum is 15 years, but under certain circumstances, they can be extended to 20. Well, all of ours are 20, the 3 that we have and the one that we're considering. So I'm not quite sure what the special circumstances are that mean they need to be 20. But that means we've got a lot of property that for 20 years is not going to be, paying money that's going towards the general fund. Right now, because of the pandemic and the CARES funds and all like that, we've got money that we're not going to always have. So, but we need, that money is not going to last for 20 years. And so we need to be careful. We need to get the money that we can. So in other words, I don't think TIF should be automatic, and I don't think that's the position of the city or the chamber now either. But they do, I think, achieve more of a public purpose unless we're talking about one of those game changer pilots.
And I'll just, for transparency's sake, I am involved in the Bend project. That's one of my projects in my day job at Reagan Smith. So I just want to be transparent there. Just what is kind of then the difference? We've talked about the reasons to use these tax incentives more broadly, but what's the reason to use a pilot versus a TIF? Is it just that level of scale to say this is a complete abatement versus this is a kind of partial?
Well, I think it's sort of a pilot really goes to a particular company, whereas a TIF, if you will, certainly goes to an applicant that is proposing a project, but it sort of benefits an area or, let's say, a neighborhood. So I think that's kind of one of the differences that I see. That one is very specific, and in a pilot, it just means the company doesn't pay a portion of their taxes, whereas on a TIF they continue to pay the taxes. And I sort of lost my train of thought there, Nathan, but it's just kind of a very different concept that TIFs kind of go to an area. Oh, I know my point. The pilot goes to the company, say they don't have to pay taxes. TIFs go for public infrastructure. Okay, so that's another kind of fundamental difference, and arguably we all benefit in the long term by there being good public infrastructure throughout town. So I think that's another kind of distinction between the two. Also, I want to, and I'm not saying this because of what you said, but I think the Bend project, and I have no idea about where they're going to request a TIF, but that project could and may and might be linked with the West Side, which, I don't think the Bend itself is blighted, but the West Side is, and I don't know if there's any discussion of trying to marry those two somehow if there were to be a TIF, which would, I think, make it better. So
is there any history of using these, jobs is kind of the classic example, but is there any examples of using tax incentives to achieve other policy goals, like say affordable housing or transit or anything along those lines?
That's an interesting thing. We're developing policies for jobs pilots and trying to, I think there's going to be some specifying the kind of sectors that we're interested in and the kind of sectors that we're not. Like we've never really been in the past. We've never done really much in the way of hospitality or retail. I mean, you can kind of see Pandora's box if we got into that. So it's been for jobs, and typically, in the early days, it was for manufacturing jobs. So that sort of is what the Industrial Development Board TIF statute and state law talks about. But there's also a pilot that can be done for housing. And that is one of the ones that probably, I think, that where we sort of came off the rails, where we never got started on the right rail, because what we were doing, the state law basically says on a pilot for housing that it must benefit low and moderate income. And for about 10 or 15 years, we didn't pay any attention. And even when we would, and this was, we had outsourced the program at that time, not to the chamber, but to another nonprofit. And at that time, even when they acknowledged that, oh yes, we have to benefit low and moderate income, they said they didn't have to get the income of the tenants. Well, how do you know if you're benefiting low and moderate income if you're not checking the income of the tenants? So fortunately, we took that program back in-house in about 2016, I think, and it's a better program now, and it's more attuned to affordable housing. And you know that Mayor Kelly has made a major commitment to affordable housing. Will some of that take the form of pilots? I imagine it might. And I have been supportive, as much as I was very much critical of what we were doing, is we were providing pilots for market rate housing. And we were given a 10-year, you don't pay any property taxes. There was no schedule or anything on it. So, apartment complexes that were, charging, $1,500, $1,800 a month, we were saying you don't have to pay property taxes. We have some of those right now. We don't do that anymore. But what we are doing is saying that you have to have a higher percentage. And what I was going to say is that as critical as I was of our doing pilots, housing pilots, what I thought were market rate projects, I've always been supportive of doing them for projects that involve low-income housing tax credits, which get to a lower level. The way we define low and moderate income in Chattanooga for our pilot program is 80% of median, but we can still, under the program, charge the developers can charge over $1,000 a month in rent. So is that really affordable? Don't know. I don't personally think so. But if you do low income housing tax credits, there's a role for the state in that. And the way Tennessee structures those, the tax credits themselves are taxed, which I've been told by people that believe in affordable housing and want to be strategic with pilots that it makes sense in the case. And we have several of those that, for example, some of these projects in the West Side have low-income housing tax credits and a pilot. Patton Towers has a pilot or whatever. So, but to answer your question, I mean, I don't know other than for housing authorities also under state law, and I'm not that familiar with that, but there's some things, they can also apply for a pilot. And in fact, I believe they were the applicant for what we used to call the JC Towers there on the West Side. That's a long-term pilot or whatever that involves low-income housing tax credits, where the housing authority is the applicant. So, I don't know of other things. You mentioned transit or whatever. I would wonder if maybe in a TIF, could something related to transit be included as infrastructure? Like I don't want to say a transit stop or whatever type thing, something that, I can see possibly, but I'm not certain. I mean, things are pretty clearly spelled out in state law, what you can and can't spend money for in a TIF. And, so transit, one thing is clear, you don't spend TIF funds for operational costs of any form of government or pilots, obviously, but the pilots go to the companies.
So what happens if one of these companies gets a pilot either for affordable housing or for jobs, and it turns out, 2-3 years later down the road, not as many jobs were created as originally promised, or the affordable housing goals are not being met and enforced, and it's actually being run as market rate housing or something along those lines? What happens then?
Well, you're talking about how, what we need to do better, and we are doing better, is putting good clawback language in the agreements that explain what happens when a company doesn't employ the number of people or doesn't make the investment they said or doesn't pay the wages they said they were going to do. Same thing with the housing. If they can't demonstrate that at least 20% of the people that they rented to were low and moderate income. That said, we have had the pilot program since about 1985, and we've probably granted 75 or 100 pilots, and we've clawed back once. And that was Alstom, when they just picked up they just closed. Okay. So we got a little bit of a little bit of a clawback there, whatever, but it's not been It's and we've had in our agreements, we have some wording that kind of says the city and county may but are not required to. So that gets me to a point that I think our tax incentives in the past, they're very much have been driven by the companies and their attorneys. I mean, they write the agreements, and if we don't at the local level really look at them with our public interest glasses on, then they're going to primarily benefit. I mean, they're going to benefit the company anyway. But I think we need to be more attentive, and are becoming more attentive to making sure that if they don't do what they say, that we get, some of the money back or whatever. So that's an area that is not perfect today, but is much better than it used to. But it's not something we have much experience in. And on all these pilot projects, there was not the appetite. I tried really hard on one near me where we actually had the opportunity, because what this company was doing is they were using our tax break as kind of as an incentive when they wanted to sell the property. I mean, this was a local developer who sold it to an RET in Nebraska, who wanted to sell it to an RET and, a real estate development trust in South Carolina, and this, that, and the other. And we just so they were using our tax break in order to sell their property and make more money. And we had an opportunity on one of these where we ATM sort of raised the question, like, well, wait a minute, this is a new deal. You have an opportunity to look at this. And we're not saying go claw back what's been done in the past, but why don't we terminate this pilot? And there was no appetite for doing that. And I think that shows how in the past, how strong the applicants and their lobby is, and how unwilling the city has been in the past to really take a look at these. But that's past, and now we're in the present, and I don't think anything like that would happen again in the current environment.
So I want to talk about a specific project that's been in the news a lot. There's been a lot of talk about the Lookout Stadium receiving state money. And I believe they just changed state law. Maybe there's a name for this that I'm not familiar with, but it sounds like a tax increment financing, but instead of being for property tax, it's for sales tax. So there's new sales tax on a property because a commercial building has been built where there was not one before. And then that sales tax gets funneled back to pay the bonds on the project. And that Chattanooga, and I guess more technically Hamilton County, was recently included in state law. They changed the population threshold so that Hamilton County could take advantage of that program. And my understanding is that was based on the Lookout Stadium. They're talking about moving to the US Pipe site and building a new stadium there. So I'm curious if you've done much research into the Lookout Stadium project. Do you know a whole lot about how these deals might be structured, and what your just kind of gut feeling is for how these incentives are being used?
One of the things I have learned is that I don't know what I think about anything until I write it down. I mean, the process of doing this sort of data dump about TIFs that is guaranteed to put people to sleep. I spend the first 2 pages trying to explain why people should read this when it's as complicated and as boring as it is, and it really is. But I think it's important that more people understand these and follow these, and in their own way, they're kind of interesting. But anyway, so until I write something down, I've just finished a little analysis of the TIF at the one near DuPont, the one that's on the table now. And I have thought about doing what I'm calling these little white papers on the Foundry site where the baseball stadium may go. A couple of initial thoughts is that I think back in 2012 at a city council meeting that involved the first TIF, I made the statement that, well, a TIF that might make some sense would be at the U.S. Pipe Wheel and Foundry site. Now, that is the kind of thing that might be your classic TIF, slum and blight, could be a game changer, is going to need all the planets to align in order for it to happen, et cetera, et cetera. And I continue to think that. To me, and I'm going to use a word that my late husband used from time to time, I am sort of bumfuzzled about the stadium. And I mean, I was all prepared to be very supportive of a TIF for that site. And it's not that I'm opposed to the stadium, but you also probably are aware that apparently the taxpayers are going to be asked to fund a good portion of the stadium. So that's where, you start looking at it and you think, okay, new interstate interchange and a property tax TIF and a sales tax TIF, and the taxpayer is going to fund 2/3 or whatever of the stadium or whatever. I mean, it kind of makes you kind of scratch your head just a little bit. I mean, it's complicated. One of the interesting things about that, the sales tax aspect is interesting, and in part, it is related to the fact that there is a special TIF for brownfield sites. And this is a brownfield site because of what used to be there and stuff, but also because it, like the Bend and like some other places around town, were designated as opportunity zones. So that makes it eligible for a brownfield TIF. So I can't get straight in my head, because I haven't really done my homework here on this, about, okay, is this going to be a regular TIF and a brownfield TIF? And I think it's because it's the brownfield TIF that it can have the sales tax TIF, but I think the sales tax only applies to sales tax collected within the stadium. And so then that gets my mind all confused, because I typically think of a TIF as being a geographic area, let's say the rectangle or whatever. Well, the stadium is going to be one component. And I think the people who are advocating for this say that it could be a catalyst. And it may be. It's the public funding that gets me a little bit weirded out on the stadium. But so is the boundary of the sales tax TIF just the stadium, or is it any sales tax that's collected in the entire TIF district, which will be larger than the stadium or whatever? So, it is just really complicated. I mean, I think it's a real opportunity. I've been a Lookouts fan all my life, and so I wish them well, and I think a stadium there could work. But it's just it's just complicated. It just has sort of every kind of dimension in it. And I think one of the things that I think we're getting better at is transparency. I mean, I think the public can accept things better if they feel like that they've been given information in a way they can understand it. And here I say this as someone that spent way too much time on this for whatever reasons, and I can't explain it in an intelligent way, but I think that our local governments are going to need to make sure, in other words, maps. I mean, it would be nice to see a map of that whole area and show, okay, now where is the stadium going, and who are the property owners here, and what would be the proposed boundary of the TIF, and answer my question: is there a difference in the brownfield TIF, and or is it just a TIF, but you can also do remediation with it? Maybe that's what it is, or whatever. But where would the sales tax TIF apply, and also some projections as to how much the cost of the TIF would be. And at the time, this TIF legislation for sales tax and for remediation, the brownfield TIF, happened in 2019. I read a report by a Nashville law firm that said that at that time, I don't think we had any sales tax TIFs in Tennessee. Now, maybe we do now, but in other words, that doesn't mean we don't go there and that it isn't a good idea, but this is just new territory, and TIFs are already complicated, and this adds another dimension. So I guess what I would encourage the developers and their consultants and staff and city and county government to do is just try to be as clear as possible. Because I think sometimes that the public gets apprehensive when they think that they're sort of being left in the dark. And, I think if we know, what the facts are and that we're a lot more able to maybe ask some good questions, but also maybe accept some outcomes. So I did want to say, I think I sort of have, is that when I talk about things being better, I think our last two pilots have been probably the best pilots we've ever done. That was the battery producer down on the Bend side and the steam logistics downtown in the old John Ross building. So I think that is positive. And I think the fact that it does look like that, that there is work being done with a community group called Caleb alongside the city economic development staff and the chamber staff to come up with some written policies and procedures for pilots. So that is huge. So I just wanted to make sure that I had said that. But I think this foundry site is fascinating, and I suspect that there's going to be, all of a sudden, we're going to see something in the paper that, maybe they've requested a TIF or whatever. And one of the things that it's kind of good to do is to kind of get ahead of this a little bit. And, I don't have the answers, obviously, but what I've tried to do is raise some of the questions. And so, they're the usual kind of TIF questions. And I think I've already said that I think this site, makes sense for a TIF. And, I think maybe we look at this, the baseball stadium funding as a separate aspect of this. But I think what probably the proponents of it, maybe the property owners and maybe the lookouts people, are saying that it could be the catalyst that's needed to help everything happen in this area. And they may be right. So then maybe there's a separate question of how much public funding is appropriate for the lookout stadium. I mean, some would say stadiums are not really economic development from the standpoint that it's a fair number of seasonal, low-paying jobs that are basically moving. It's not new revenue or whatever. But on the other hand, as a game changer, as something that might cause a lot of other stuff to happen around it, they can probably make a good case because they want to make it into an entertainment venue and things like that. So anyway, a lot more study done. I'm just hoping that the people who are promoting it will be forthcoming with a lot of information, a lot of good maps, so that the public kind of knows what's being proposed and why they believe this is a good thing for the public. As I said, I'm there just on the regular old-timey TIF. I think that site really warrants it. But just making it a TIF doesn't necessarily provide the catalyst. And I think some people are saying, well, this stadium could be the catalyst. So, I'm going to try to be open-minded about it. I think it's an interesting project for sure.
So I'll provide one definition real quick and then start to wrap things up. You mentioned brownfields several times, and just for our listeners, that refers to basically contaminated soils based on old industrial facilities, foundry sands, things of that nature. And because of the industrial history of Chattanooga, we have a lot of brownfields here within the city limits, especially on the south side, South Broad, that whole area, because of the industrial history of our city. So I just want to make sure all of our listeners are up to speed on that term, because it's probably going to come up a lot as we see more development in these areas, and we might start to see some of these brownfield TIFs start to get written. So I want to wrap things up, and I was just wondering if you could tell us how to get involved with ATM, where to read more of your work, and also if there's any way people can get involved on a more regular basis. You mentioned it's a lot of different people bouncing ideas off of each other. So if you could just let people know how to get involved.
Sure. There is a website, atmchat.com. Right now is pretty much under construction, in part because, when I read it, it was, I started writing it 5 or 6 years ago, where I was very frustrated with housing pilots and some of the jobs pilots and everything else. And now that we're doing so much better, I thought, well, I'm going to take that down, and hopefully in the not too distant future, going to put some things up about all the positive changes. So anyway, so atmchat.com, and it also has a form where you can contact me. And in addition to ATM, I would suggest to people that the last thing that I intended to do was to get involved in, this isn't planning or community development in the sense that I was familiar with and am very interested in. This basically is public finance. And this is not something that, I would have thought I was going to spend my encore career on, but you surprise yourself sometimes when you run across something that you think, well, this matters and nobody else seems to be looking at it. So I think I'm going to try to look at it or whatever. But my advice to people is get involved in city government in some way. There's so many opportunities. And I think one of the things you're going to come away with is an appreciation of, let's take the city council and the mayor and all, the breadth and the depth of issues they have to deal with. TIFs are so complicated, and TIFs are one of thousands of things that's on their plate. So, I think not as critics, but as people who can get involved and learn and maybe volunteer to be on the board or show up and give some input, including, when you go to a public hearing, it doesn't have to be negative comments. You can say positive things about what the city is doing or whatever, but there are just so many opportunities. And I think people might be surprised with how interesting some of this stuff is. So yes, please check out atm.com if you're interested in this, and I'll get you on a mailing list, and I will make sure to let you know too. I mentioned some of these white papers, and probably I will put them on the website, or if not, I will let you know how you can get that if you're really interested in the really boring thing on tax increment financing, hot off the press almost. You can certainly do that, and then hopefully there's going to be something pretty soon about the new pilot policies and procedures that we hope the city council is going to adopt. So it's an exciting time, and I think Chattanooga's just got so much potential, and I think in this area we need this in our toolbox. But let's be strategic and let's do things that are very well thought out if we're going to give tax incentives.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your hard work on this complicated subject.
Thank you, Nathan.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Chattanooga Civics. Our music was written and recorded by Kevin MacLeod. If you have any questions or feedback, please send me an email at chattanoogacivics@gmail.com. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @ChatCivics, or visit the website chattanoogacivics.com. Thanks for listening.